4,400 warships entered Earth's orbit. Not one of them reported back. Not a single distress signal. Not a single piece of wreckage recovered. Not one survivor's account making it into the official record. And here's the part that should bother you more than the silence itself. Nobody figured out what actually happened by studying the battle. They figured it out because a records clerk, the kind of person whose entire job is to notice nothing more exciting than a misfiled date, found one number that was 14 seconds wrong. That 14-second error is where this story actually begins. And by the time it ends, you're going to understand why an empire that commanded thousands of warships was more afraid of what they learned than of losing the fleet in the first place. Her job wasn't glamorous. She checked paperwork for mistakes. She corrected classification errors. She made sure the Empire's records stayed clean and searchable, and her only real professional pride came from catching exactly the kind of tiny discrepancy everyone else waved away. So when she found a confirmation signal that had arrived before the fleet's own instruments said it reached its position, she should have shrugged it off as a clerical glitch and moved on with her week. Instead, she sat with it. Because 14 seconds isn't nothing in a universe governed by the speed of light. A signal claiming to originate from a location can't arrive before the ship gets there. Not unless it was sent by something that was already waiting at that location before the fleet ever showed up. She filed a discrepancy notice. It got marked low priority and buried in a growing pile of anomalies the Empire had quietly started calling the Earth Silence. Most people would have let that be the end of it. She pulled every file she could access instead, stacked them on her desk, and started reading from page 1. What she found first wasn't the disappearance of the fleet. It was everything that happened in the 72 hours before the fleet arrived, hours during which, according to every long-range observation post watching the system, humanity behaved like a civilization that already knew exactly what was coming. Every major orbital installation went dark at once. Not destroyed, not abandoned. Dark, deliberately, in a way that looked like a plan rather than a panic. Communication traffic that had been loud and overlapping in the way any frightened species generates suddenly dropped to almost nothing. Almost. Because on one old frequency band, one the Empire's own analysts had assumed humans had abandoned decades earlier for anything important, there was a single unbroken transmission looping for 71 straight hours, right up until the moment the fleet entered orbit. Nobody in the Empire had bothered translating it. It got flagged as a probable automated distress beacon and shelved. When she finally got someone to translate it properly, it came out to 3 words: "We remember this." She sat with that phrase longer than she expected to. Then she went looking for what happened to the fleet itself and discovered that of the 4,400 ships sent to force humanity's compliance, exactly 7 came home. The Empire's official explanation was a navigational catastrophe near the star. A story comfortable enough that nobody had to ask harder questions about what a Class 4 civilization had actually done to a fleet that size. She found the real debrief buried under 4 layers of clearance she wasn't supposed to have, and she read it late at night with the lights turned down. The way you read something you already suspect is going to change how you see everything else. The surviving crews described achieving orbital position without incident. Weapons live, sensors nominal, waiting on final authorization, right up until their arrays started returning contact signatures that didn't match anything in the Empire's threat database. Signatures too large, too coordinated, moving with a kind of tactical precision no primitive civilization should have been capable of. One surviving commander said it plainly in the transcript. It was as if they expected us. Not as if they had a fleet ready to fight. As if they already knew exactly where the Empire's ships were going to be positioned before the Empire's own ships got there. The 7 survivors hadn't scattered randomly across the wreckage of the formation. Every single one of them came from the exact same section, the rear left flank, as though something had made a deliberate decision to let that specific slice of the fleet go. No accident produces that kind of geometric precision. When she pulled crew manifests looking for what made those 7 ships different from the other 4,393, she found that 3 of them had been carrying observers, civilian specialists whose entire function was to document and report, people with no access to weapons and no reason to be considered a threat. All 3 of those PS had survived. The observers had been recording right up until everything else disappeared. Naturally, she went looking for those recordings, and naturally they weren't there. In their place was a placeholder notice citing a council directive she'd never heard of, restricted to council eyes only. It took her nearly a week to find someone old enough to remember the last time that kind of directive had been used, decades earlier, to seal an entire colony's history from public knowledge, because what happened there had been judged too destabilizing for ordinary people to process. When she told him what she'd found, he didn't ask her a single question. He just said the question was never what the observers recorded. The question was why the humans let the observer ships leave at all. The answer, once the analysis team's one leaked finding made it briefly into an open file before someone caught the mistake and sealed it again, was almost worse than anything she'd imagined. In the recordings, you could see clearly, unambiguously, that as the rest of the fleet was being destroyed, a specific corridor had been left open deliberately, precisely, for exactly those 3 ships and no others. Humanity hadn't spared them by accident. Humanity had wanted witnesses, not military command. Not the council. The people whose entire job was to remember and record accurately. They wanted the right people to see what had happened, and they knew, with unsettling confidence, that the Empire had people like her, people constitutionally incapable of letting an inconsistency lie unexamined, who would eventually go looking. She went back to the parts of the record she could still legally access. Preliminary logs filed by the observers before the real documentation began, classified at a much lower tier because nobody thought fragments mattered. The first log noted, with total clinical detachment, that Earth's major population centers were producing far less thermal output than expected. The cities had been emptied in advance, calmly, not in a scramble. The second noted that human orbital infrastructure had been quietly repositioned over the preceding weeks, on a timeline that lined up almost exactly with when the Empire issued its internal, classified deployment order. An order there was no legitimate way for humans to have known about. The third log was the one that made her put the document down and sit still for a long time. Buried in a technical appendix was a note about a transmission originating from somewhere deep underground, using a modulation pattern that matched nothing in the Empire's own technology archive, except for the fact that it was broadcasting on a frequency band reserved exclusively for the Empire's encrypted military command traffic. Human hands, operating on a military channel that belonged to the Empire before the fleet had even arrived. She went back through 60 years of observation records looking for the first point of contact, and she found it in year 11 of monitoring. A human research vessel passing within a few light hours of an unmanned relay station, logged as routine, except for a technical note about a 40-second signal dropout that the station explained away as cosmic ray interference. Except cosmic interference doesn't produce a clean, complete blackout that resolves with every system reporting perfectly nominal and not a single logged error. Something had reached into that station, learned everything it needed to learn, and left without a trace. 11 years into observation, 48 years before the fleet was ever assembled. We remember this, playing on an old frequency, suddenly made a very different kind of sense. It wasn't a warning aimed outward at the Empire. It was humans speaking to humans. We learned their language. We've been waiting. Hold the line. At this point she understood. She'd gone well past professional curiosity into territory that could cost her everything. Her clearance, her career, possibly her freedom. Because council-level seals weren't used out of bureaucratic caution. They were used when the council decided something was dangerous not to individual people, but to the shared assumptions holding the whole civilization together. She reached out to the one person she could think of with both the access and the reason to help, one of the 3 surviving crew members who'd come back from the expedition needing medical isolation, now working quietly in a job that used none of her old training, known around the office for going very still in a way that had nothing to do with rest. She sent a single line. I found the 14-second timestamp. The reply came back in 4 minutes. Come now. In person, in a bare apartment with a single framed piece of human writing on the wall, the surviving officer finally told her what she hadn't been allowed to say to anyone. Humanity had made contact before a single shot was fired. A transmission arrived on the Empire's own command frequency, and the fleet commander received it personally, in the tactical room, in front of witnesses. It gave the entire armada exactly 1 hour to leave. The commander logged it as a curiosity for later psychological study and stayed anyway. What happened after that wasn't a battle in any sense a career tactical officer recognized. It was, in her words, like watching someone who had spent 48 years learning every gear inside a machine reach in and close their hand around exactly the right ones all at once. Not overwhelming firepower, not a bigger fleet, just absolute, patient understanding of every weakness, used with total precision. And the survivors hadn't been spared by chance either. The corridor had been decided in advance, who would leave, what they would carry home with them, and why. The observers were protected specifically, deliberately, in the middle of the destruction of over 4,000 other ships, because humanity wanted a very particular kind of person to eventually find this thread and follow it all the way back to a room exactly like the one they were sitting in now. The framed text on the wall, it turned out, was an old human treatise on war translated years after the incident. One line from it summed up everything humanity had apparently been trying to demonstrate. The supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting, except they had fought, which meant, chillingly, that this hadn't been the full extent of what they were capable of, only enough to make the point land. The report she eventually filed ran 800 pages and took 4 months to compile, folding in every anomaly, every timestamp, every relay blackout, every fragment of the observer logs. The Council's response took 11 days, unusually fast for them, and it wasn't a reprimand or an order to stop. It was a single question. Had the humans made any contact since the incident? She answered honestly, no, nothing at all. The Council's second reply, 6 days later, was just as short. They will determine the correct response. She spent a long time turning that sentence over, because a species patient enough to spend nearly 5 decades quietly mapping an opponent's every weakness before making a single deliberate move wasn't a species waiting nervously for anyone's next step. If anything, the Council's careful, drawn-out silence probably read to humanity exactly as it was intended to, as the message being received, filed, and understood. She asked the one question that had been sitting under everything else. What happens next? What are they saving themselves for? The answer she got back was the coldest part of the whole story. Not us, she was told. We were a demonstration, a test case for whoever came after. The Council believed its secrecy directive was about controlling panic over the loss of the fleet. The real reason, she learned, was buried in the final minute of the sealed recordings. The part that had put 3 crew members in medical isolation in the first place. In that final minute, as the corridor opened and the surviving ship began to move, an open transmission came through, not on any encrypted channel, clearly meant to be heard and recorded. A single human voice, speaking the Empire's own language with flawless precision, addressed the fleet commander by name and said, "Thank you for the demonstration. We have sent full records of this engagement to 14 other civilizations currently living inside your Empire's territory. We suggest you reconsider your expansion policies. This offer of peaceful withdrawal will not be extended a second time. The next civilization you threaten may not be as patient as we are." Patient. Out of every word available to describe a species that had just dismantled the largest fleet the Empire had ever assembled without losing a single one of their own people in any confirmed record, that was the word they chose to leave behind. Not powerful, not dangerous, not victorious. Patient, as though patience itself were the most important thing for everyone watching to understand about them. And everyone was watching, because 14 other civilizations now had a complete recording of a species being warned, refusing to leave, and paying for it in full, in front of an audience the humans had personally selected. The Empire's entire expansion doctrine had rested on a single assumption: that overwhelming force makes resistance irrational, and rational beings submit rather than fight a battle they can't win. Humans hadn't just refused to submit. They had made resistance expensive enough, public enough, and precise enough that every other civilization in the region now had to factor an entirely new possibility into their own calculations. The possibility of a species that could wait decades, learn every seam in an empire's military, and close its hand at exactly the right moment, then choose, quite deliberately, to stop. That was the detail that never really left her, not the empty ships, not the perfect silence afterward, not even the 3 words that had started the whole search. It was how calmly humanity had decided that this was enough, that 4,393 destroyed warships, 7 ships sent home with a message, and a polite, precisely worded warning to 14 neighboring civilizations was the complete extent of what they intended to do for now. Because a species capable of all of that, choosing on its own terms exactly where to stop, was not a species anyone wanted to find out about the day they decided to stop being patient.